Welcome to Dynasty Life. I'm Theo Gremminger. Redraft ends, but Dynasty is life. Repeat guest in the house. You may know him, an up and coming podcaster and fantasy football content creator. No, I'm just joking. It's Heath Cummings from CBS. Heath, you crush it every time you're on Dynasty Life. You're doing tremendous stuff over at CBS. Fantasy Football Today, Dynasty. You're recording regularly, covering Dynasty constantly. You're doing a great job this summer. What do you have going on the next few weeks?
Yeah, I tell you what, like right this second is the point where my editor starts saying, you know what, you should start producing a little bit of redraft content as well. So I could cut back to Dynasty just a little bit, but I just had 32 beat writers on this week actually to kind of talk about some of the OTA news and then what we're looking for in training camp. I've got Justin Boone coming on next week, recording once a week right now, generally on Tuesdays, like to go about an hour. I just love, like most of the time, especially when it comes to redraft, I'm sitting in this chair that I'm sitting in right now, and Adam Azer's asking me questions, and I get to talk for however long. But I love that role that you're in right now. We're just like, let's get somebody else's opinion. Let's probe a little bit and see if we can learn something from someone else.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that you bring up an interesting point where this is the time of year where it's redraft sort of merging with Dynasty, and then Dynasty sort of moves to the back burner when everybody has their home league drafts. Really, it's July and August is peak redraft season, and then Dynasty sort of never stops. But that's a great segue to today's focus. And we're going to talk about how we're going to use ADP. We're going to use sort of the helium from best ball and early redraft ADP to find some players that we can sell. And as forward thinking and as analytical and as long-term planning as Dynasty managers are, and I think Dynasty managers overall are getting better and better these days with such vast resources to pull from and a lot of Dynasty theory sort of in play, people still think short-term. People still are going to let the market affect their decisions. I remember a few years back, Garrett Wilson rookie season, Courtland Sutton had his steam. Russell Wilson was going to make him this incredible player that year. Everybody was betting on the Denver Broncos, and I was able to flip Courtland Sutton for like Garrett Wilson before he played it down. Remember the Elijah Moore? I had a Garrett Wilson at the time. So I got a Garrett Wilson and a couple of draft picks for Courtland Sutton because people think short term and people make decisions that are not always the best for their long-term planning. Sometimes that works for them. A lot of times it doesn't. And we're going to look to sort of exploit that market. But Heath, let's start out the question that everybody gets on First Class Fantasy, press coverage, Dynasty Life, you name it. If you could know the final stats of any single player this year, who would it be?
Any single player? Well, I think it would probably be Tank Dell, because that's going to help me to better understand this Texans offense. And, Jacob Gibbs, who I know you interact with quite a bit, does a great job for us at CBS Fantasy. And right now has been kind of going through and breaking down a preseason preview of every team. And he did the Texans, I think, today or yesterday. And it's one of those offenses where we expect the pie to be pretty big, but we've got a pretty ambiguous wide receiver room. Nico Collins is awesome. Tank Dell is my favorite guy. Stephon Diggs has been like a spectacular wide receiver for the last half a decade at least, but maybe fell off last year. And then we've got, also the new Joe Mixon situation as well. So you give me Tank Dell's numbers, and I feel like I can better piece together that entire pie.
I love the Tank Dell choice because you don't go to the top of the food chain and tell us like what are Nico Collins' final numbers, because Nico Collins is going to cost us a premium. If Nico Collins finishes as wide receiver 12 like he did last year, again, that's going to be like, okay, you got your value back where you had to draft him. But Tank Dell, people look at the underdog model a lot. And if you look strictly at underdog, Tank Dell is extremely expensive still because of the way wide receivers are getting steamed up the board.
Right.
But if you take a look at like NFFC and FFPC, some of these higher stakes ADPs that are coming out, you get like a several round gap between second round Nico Collins, early third round Nico Collins, and then Tank Dell, who's going like towards the end of the fifth round. Stephon Diggs is a good 15 spots ahead of Tank Dell. And I think like me and you talked last year during the Tank Dell ascent about how enthusiastic we were about him and just how incredible a breakout he was having. It was sort of a Puka Nacua versus Tank Dell argument to an extent.
Right.
And now the market has sort of pushed him down to the point where I can get Tank Dell in any dynasty league right now for like a future 2025 first. People are taking that deal all day long because of the quality of the wide receivers around him. And at the end of the day, Heath, Tank Dell was remarkable in a points per game basis. So I love that you went with that one. He could be a real cheat code for you, not only in redraft best ball, but also as just a dynasty trade target.
Well, I think the last time we talked, you asked me to send buys. This time you asked me to send sells. But if you would have asked me to send buys, I definitely would have had Tank Dell on that buy list because I do see him as a top 20 dynasty wide receiver right now. Before the Diggs deal, I was thinking more top 15. That just adds a little bit of uncertainty for this year and for the fact of like, do the Texans have the concerns that a lot of people had coming in that a player of Tank Dell's size wouldn't be able to hold up to the NFL and then he breaks his leg? And so now they're not quite sure. I tell you who doesn't seem to have any concerns at all about Tank Dell is CJ Stroud.
100%. He goes out of his way to prop him up with like all-time greats when he's asked to have his like dream wide receiver room. And Heath, I guess I'm sort of typecasting you as a trade guy every time you're a guest on Dynasty Life. Next time you're in the seat, we're going to do like deep dynasty theory, something like that. But it sure is fun talking about trades this time of year because, again, I think we can exploit the market. Let's take it a step back. We talked a little bit about a player. Every year we see these ascending offenses that drive multiple players to ADP wins on the same team. It's sort of a breakout offense, but also coupled into the cost where the ADP plays a factor in this one. If you're looking across the board, who's an offense that you think could support multiple ADP winners this year?
So I'm going to say this just starting off because I know that like if you ask this question to any normal person, we'd probably get either the Jets or the Falcons or the Cardinals. Like those guys, like we're drafting Bijan and Drake London to be better than they've ever been, and Garrett Wilson to finally be the guy we expect him to be, and Marvin Harrison is going to change. Kyler Murray's back to the Cardinals. I'm not going to take any of those offenses everybody else is excited about. I'm going to blow your mind for a second. Just hold on to your chair. It's the Pittsburgh Steelers for me. I think people are really underestimating the upgrades almost all the way around for this offense. And yes, I know that Arthur Smith is the offensive coordinator. I feel relatively confident saying that Arthur Smith is an upgrade over Matt Canada. And Arthur Smith's Falcons, with the quarterbacks he had last year, threw more passes than the Steelers anyway. I love the setup for George Pickens. I expect a bounce back for Pat Freiermuth. And I think one of Najee Harris or Jaylen Warren has an excellent chance to just crush ADP.
I like that one a lot because I think you talk about the upgrades, and it's certainly like a Russell Wilson and Justin Fields at this point in their careers are not like the perfect quarterback. They're a huge upgrade over what we saw last year. Offensive line is one of the most improved ones in the league. And yeah, I guess, you know, the Steelers players probably have like PTSD from the Matt Canada era. So literally anybody is going to be an upgrade, even Arthur Smith. And you know, all jokes aside, Arthur Smith is super interesting. Like the running backs, it's a low-hanging fruit almost because the guy churns out fantasy victories at the running back position.
Yep.
Consistently. Tyler Algier, Cordero Patterson, let alone the big dog and Bijan finishing as a, you know, in a frustrating sense, but he was still a easy RB1 last year. Pickens is interesting. Pickens is a guy that I love, but it's sort of a philosophical hurdle for him to overcome. We haven't seen a wide receiver get 120 targets, you know, really go north of that in an Arthur Smith offense, but we have seen it with Mike Tomlin a lot of times. And then you get the reports out of camp about how there's some indecision over who the wide receiver 2 is. I think this could be like the most targeted Arthur Smith wide receiver of all time, including A.J. Brown and including Drake London. So I'm with you. Pickens is almost like where he's being priced everywhere. It's sort of like still a guy you want to bet on, 23 years old. I love that answer. That was a really good one. Do you have this year's version of, and now this one I throw it out there, is there anybody that sort of parallels any of the hits from last year? We've had some all over the place answers here on this one. I had Ryan Heath and Bradley Stouder give me a Kendre Miller as this year's Kyren Williams, which is not going to happen, guys. But it was interesting the way they phrased it. I've got a couple other analysts who have tried to go a little bit lower bar, and that's fine. Not even going to call them out, but I had this year's Baker Mayfield, this year's Sam Howell mixed in. Do you see any parallels between a big time hit from last year and anybody this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem with that for me is like you talk about this year's Puka Nacua. Well, it's nobody. Like nobody's going to do what Puka Nacua did. But if you're talking about who's this year's wide receiver as a rookie, who's falling to round 3, who I think could actually just like make a difference this year in fantasy football, which is rare enough, and really fly up dynasty boards, for me, it's Malachi Corley. And I think we've talked about Corley in the past. There's been some rumblings coming out of New York that like this was the guy that Aaron Rodgers wanted them to go get. I'm always a little bit of a sucker for those kinds of things. I love guys that win in unique ways. And some people look at Corley, and maybe I'm just an optimist. They look at him and say, well, I don't like it that he does all that stuff after the catch because that means that he can't do things down the field. What I say is I've got a guy that I know he's elite at something. Like let's build on that. And I do believe that he's elite on that. I think he's closer to a Deebo Samuel than he is to a Rondale Moore or somebody like General LaVisca Chenault. We don't generally say that name, but I could see Malachi Corley being the 3rd round rookie wide receiver who improves his stock the most in year 1. No, he's not going to be Puka Nacua, but he absolutely could be a huge win in terms of value from a dynasty perspective in the next 6 months.
I love that one. And we've talked about him with a lot of enthusiasm. This was also like a 3rd round pick, but he was super early in the 3rd round. It was almost a 2nd round pick. And I know that's sort of a, I'm sort of nitpicking and trying to trade a narrative, but Malachi Corley was close to being a 2nd round draft pick. Malachi Corley falls into a team where we know what Tyler Conklin is. We know Mike Williams is sort of a 1-year hit, if anything. And Malachi Corley, he's got that diverse skill set that I know you've talked about at length, Heath, and you've been a super enthusiastic Malachi Corley guy for a while. But yeah, I agree with you. I think this one could really hit. He's been a big target of mine in best ball because he's sort of always there on underdog drafts. And in Dynasty, he's still a guy where people can't really wrap their heads around. There's a Curtis Samuel type vibe. Then the bull case is the
right.
Deebo Samuel. But I don't know if it's necessarily going to be one of those Swiss Army knife guys. They will use him differently than Western Kentucky did because Western Kentucky had to maximize, what they had in him, use that yak. He's going to have to be a little bit more diverse to help the Jets this year, and they need a secondary target at wide receiver. I love that one. Is there any other rookie sleepers that you're looking at, a guy that maybe besides Malachi Corley that we could be really kicking ourselves for not drafting more of? Like, do you have any FOMO from your rookie drafts? Like, wish I would have had a little bit more exposure to this guy.
Well, I mean, obviously, I wish I had a little bit more of Puka 2 years ago, but no, I think like I'm going to go with the guy, and it's probably more a 2 QB call, but I'm not entirely sure that it will be. I'm going to go with Bo Nix. I think this was a perfect fit for the Sean Payton system. Just absolutely will thrive in the complete opposite way of like Payton tried to force Russell Wilson to this thing that all of us knew Russell Wilson wasn't going to be good at, but Bo Nix was built for it. Wouldn't be surprised if he completes 67-70% of his passes this year. I would expect that he's going to be a top 20 fantasy quarterback this season.
I like that one a lot. Bo Nix is one where it was sort of easy to pile on. People were almost like annoyed by how early they selected him in the NFL draft. But like you said, it's a perfect fit. It's sort of this worked with Drew Brees. We had a hyper accurate guy. And with Bo Nix, he has the ability to run the football and manufacture some points with his legs. So if he just gets rushing opportunities and he's highly accurate and they put him in a position to just complete a lot of passes, I'm with you. I think he could be a top 20 quarterback and a guy who's going to gain some dynasty value, and certainly one where he was going right at the end of the 1st round in rookie drafts, where it really was you could have traded a random 2025 first for Bo Nix. And I think without getting too forward thinking about this 2025 class, I think a lot of when we get to the end of the year, there's going to be some dynasty managers out there thinking, yeah, I would trade maybe quarterback 3 in this 2025 class for Bo Nix easily. And I could have made that decision a year ago. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, Heath and I are going to discuss, of course, some of these sell high options. But before we do that, we're going to talk about a little bit of recent news. We're going to talk about the running back situation in Green Bay. And we're also going to talk about some post-hype sleepers, guys that we think could bounce back based on their ADP from last year. We will be right back.
Hey, why do we partner with the FFPC? Because they have the widest variety of fantasy football formats, and it's the easiest place to find all types of fantasy football contests in the world. What if you want to play for high stakes? Well, they have a $6 million prize pool with their Fantasy Players Championship. They also have way too early best ball leagues that start in February and Dynasty leagues. They have the closest thing to a liquid market for orphans that there is in all of Dynasty. And the FFPC has sponsored us for half a decade because we are actually delivering information that can help fantasy gamers, and they're generating so much interest and bringing in so many new users, casual users even. The FFPC creates a unique experience where you can both compete against the best and make money. Use promo code UNDERWORLD to get $25 off your first team. $25 off your first team at the FFPC with promo code UNDERWORLD. Go get it!
Shout out to Matt Kelly for the FFPC ad. I actually am in an FFPC draft right now, and I selected Jonathan Brooks in like the 6th round, so it's already fresh on my mind. It's one of these slow drafts, Heath. Do you like a slow draft format, or are you a live draft kind of guy?
I like both. I think they both serve their purpose. Just this past weekend, I was in Kansas City for the Scott Fishbowl live draft, and that just reminded me, like, when that's right and it's good, it's about the best experience there is. But from a, like, I really want to draft the best team perspective, for me, slow draft is undoubtedly the better way to be. Like, when you're in the live draft with maybe a 60-second clock and maybe everybody has a drink at their side and there's loud music and there's lots of stuff going on, it's much easier to make mistakes. I'd rather have the slow draft where I can make that pick from the comfort of my own home.
I agree with you. I think that, like, slow draft, it's the best possible way for you to kind of look at everything, make your reactions. Even a 2-hour slow draft, I still have plenty of time to take in the information, but I'll throw an asterisk on it. You do not want to be in a slow draft, especially a 6-hour one, when you get close to the NFL season.
Right.
Those are torture. Everybody uses the entire clock thinking like some guy's going to get hurt while I'm OTC. And occasionally that has happened over the years. So it's like hey, remember when Spencer Ware went down and I was OTC? Like, guys will tell these stories. So be careful with the slow drafts when you get in the late summer, but July, perfectly fine to do a nice slow draft. But that looked like a lot of fun. The live fishbowl drafts. That's one thing I would like to do. Mine is slow right now. We're only in like round 5. We had a couple guys who are going the full clock. But let's get back to it. We've talked about Ben Sinnott, the tight end for Washington. There's been a couple reports out about how Sinnott is going to be used as a like kind of a fullback, an H-back type role. They're going to move him around a little bit. Do you take this as a bull argument for Sinnott, where they're trying to find ways to get him on the field and exploit matchups? Or does this make you take a step back and worry a little bit that it's going to be a little bit more Zach Ertz early in the season?
So I think it's kind of a 2-part answer, but I pretty much had the expectation, and I generally do, with rookie tight ends who are not just the elite of the elite. And I like Sinnott very much, but I don't think he's that. That, like, I would much rather just make a trade offer for them in 13 months than I would draft them. And so that's kind of where I was with Sinnott, unless I could get him in round 3 of rookie drafts. But I like what I didn't want to hear, and I think what we all thought was a little bit of a risk, was that teams were going to see him as also a fullback, or in kind of moving him around and working that low, because that is not, like, it's good for football teams, but it's not generally very good for fantasy production. I do think that, like, if the perception on him gets pushed down so low because Zach Ertz is the starting tight end week 1, then the buy window might open up even earlier than I thought it was going to. Listen, we all saw how good Trey McBride was in the second half of the season, and he was playing behind Zach Ertz at the beginning of last year. Zach Ertz, with a rookie quarterback, with a head coach who has had him on the team before, is going to get every opportunity to be the lead pass-catching tight end for as long as he can stay upright.
Yeah, I think your answer was interesting. I think at first it's going to be the luxury of having Zach Ertz, especially with the familiarity he has with Cliff Kingsbury. I think that first month could be annoying, but yeah. I'm of the opinion, I think the market's correct on Sinnott, where he's like tight end 20 on Underdog. I think if we think about some of the impactful tight end rookie years, you bring up McBride, obviously was a second-year guy, but like a Pat Freiermuth-like approach, where Muth was a second-round pick as well, but the beginning of the season was like an Eric Ebron. then cleared a path and moved with a guy we leaned on for like 8-9 games to end the year. I could see that. I think I'm going to take. I've seen some smart people that are really not liking seeing this news where he's, the H-back stuff, but I think I'll take a counter approach, and it's they want to get him on the field. They want to find a way to get him the ball, and they want to maximize their personnel. So we'll see which way that goes. Another situation where it's been a guy that I've been on heavily in all formats is MarShawn Lloyd. And we see a beat reporter this week making the comparison stylistically that MarShawn Lloyd is going to be the Aaron Jones and Josh Jacobs is going to be the A.J. Dillon. Now, that's certainly not necessarily a usage thing, but it could be more of a stylistic, some of the packages and whatnot. Obviously, Josh Jacobs is the guy who finished RB1 overall. I know you're a fan of Josh Jacobs. Are you starting to feel a little bit of the pressure behind him, worried a little bit about Jacobs in this situation?
Yeah, I thought when the Packers signed Jacobs, it kind of had this moment where it was like, well, are they going to change the way that they've used their running backs? They've never really been, and LaFleur especially, like no matter where he's been, never really been a workhorse running back guy. But Josh Jacobs is a workhorse running back. Like we have no doubt that he can fulfill that role. And I really thought Jacobs might change him, and now it's seeming more like that's not the case to me. I am feeling the downward pressure on Josh Jacobs. I don't really like him very much as an RB1 this season, and that's pretty bad for his dynasty value right in the middle of his career if he's not a fantasy RB1 this year. And I think for Lloyd, this is exactly what you were hoping to hear, that he's looking like the clear RB2, that he's going to have a 1B-ish, maybe not quite 1B, but a 1B-ish type role as a rookie, and then just a wide open runway to be special after that.
Yeah, and spoiler alert, we might talk a little bit about Josh Jacobs later on the show, Heath. He might be on the list. Let's stick with Green Bay, not even on the show sheet, but I have seen some people talking about a Christian Watson bounce back. We, of course, had Jaden Reed last year, who had a really special finish to the season, gave you like top 10 wide receiver numbers over the last like 8 games. It was certainly a hit where they drafted him in the second round. Then you've got a couple of other guys mixed in. Dontavian Wicks, who a lot of analytical people really seem to love. Romeo Doubs, who's sort of a pain in the butt for fantasy managers because he's always there and he's never in the lineup and never even on a roster, and you'll just have these annoying games.
Right.
What would be the wide receiver, and of course Christian Watson, who the bounce back of these guys? Is there a way you're looking to play the Green Bay wide receiver room this year in redraft, best ball, dynasty? You name the format. Do you really have interest in one or two of these players, or is this a situation where the uncertainty scares you a little bit?
I think the uncertainty is the more likely thing to win on. I think you really hit the nail on the head on the fact that like Romeo Doubs is not going anywhere, and especially not to the bench or the sideline. He's their full-time wide receiver. And then let's see how the rest of the parts can stay healthy and fit around him. If I'm going to make a wager on a guy, and I almost, when you said who is this year's, I almost said Christian Watson is this year's Nico Collins, because if there's a third-year wide receiver who hasn't had a 700-yard season yet, who's just going to light the world on fire, it's Christian Watson. Let's just hope that having hamstrings that are the same size is all he ever needed to stay healthy, because if he does, I think Jaden Reed at his ADP is in big, big trouble. I would expect that Watson's going to be the guy who's on the field more and the guy who's making the bigger plays. So at his cost especially, Watson is the guy I would be betting on in this receiving core.
I think that's a super interesting parallel that you bring with Watson and Collins. Certainly the ADP is a lot higher, but situationally a big outside wide receiver in an ambiguous wide receiver room, that you could see it happening. I mean, if Watson just stays healthy, he's going to have spike weeks, and this could end up being a little bit more consistent. I think Watson is a guy that actually is going to see his ADP rise a little bit as we go throughout the summer. I think if you want your Christian Watson, you should be drafting him right now. Yeah. He might go up a full round. Very, very interesting stuff. Let's talk a little bit, because Watson, you're always giving great segues, Heath. You're a real pro with this, but it's a post-type sleeper. And we're not going to throw Watson on the post-type sleepers, but you sort of made a bull case for that. Watson was a late third-round pick last year in redraft, and now like in the 7th, 8th round in a lot of formats. But let's talk about another player, and this has a lot of dynasty impact as well, and it's Jaxon Smith-Njigba. It's a player that I remain enthusiastic about. I think that he's going to have a big step forward type year. I love the offensive coordinator and Ryan Grubb, and I like sort of the vibes with JSN. But what's interesting, Heath, is he's getting passed by not only like the elite wide receivers in this rookie class, which we expected, but Brian Thomas, Xavier Worthy, Keon Coleman, Ladd McConkey all go ahead of JSN on Underdog right now, which I think creates sort of a artificial market for JSN as a dynasty trade target. Where are you at on how do you think JSN will do this season? Is there sort of a way we can exploit this market to get ourselves from JSN, or are you like, I have enough?
I'm scared to death because I'm scared in both directions. On the one hand, this was a guy that we all pretty much thought was the best wide receiver in this class, and then he got drafted into a bad situation as maybe he wasn't wide receiver one for people in Dynasty just because of that. But we still thought talent-wise, like another guy who could just be a top 12 wide receiver any day now. And there was that concern. There's that concern with Rhamondre that the same thing's going to happen to him this year. But on the other hand, you look at now, what is it, the last 4 years for him, and he has one productive season of playing football. And that does matter. I mean, there's good reasons for it. Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf, who, by the way, are both still there, are good reasons for last year. And there was the injuries before that. But I'm scared to miss it, and I'm scared to be too overly invested. It's kind of one of those guys where you can't use the projections model, I don't think, and make a good case for JSN. It's got you mentioned the vibes, and the vibes are good. The pedigree is great. If my approach to JSN is let's make sure I'm not under or over market on him, because I don't know. I think it could be an enormous hit or miss.
I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. And I think it's sort of a exposure type market.
Yeah.
And a lot of like, if you have a single dynasty team, then you're going to have to make a real call on some of these guys. But most people have a lot of dynasty teams these days. So it's sort of if you went crazy and you got a ton of JSN in your rookie drafts a year ago, then maybe it's time to sort of pivot to a one of these rookies. But on the flip side, if you missed out on JSN in your rookie drafts and you are without a lot of exposure to him, I do think it's a good time to try to kick the tires. So I'm with you. I think it's a range of outcomes guy. I'll take a bull approach. I think you're taking a cautious approach. I'll go a little bit more bullish.
I mean, you can call me scared. It's okay. It's a scared approach. Cautious. I am terrified of all results with JSN.
There you go. And you also don't want to get burned on this one too. It's sort of like I was bullish on a guy. Now I'm backing up, and then he has a smash year. It's like, why did I lose my enthusiasm? There's all kinds of things to worry about. I'll give you that one. Let's talk a little bit about Rhamondre Stevenson. And this is certainly not a back he's not like a spring chicken. When we talk about Josh Jacobs, like Rhamondre Stevenson and Jacobs, it seems like Jacobs would be older, but they're about the same age. Rhamondre Stevenson, 2 years ago, finishes as an RB1, was a very graceful, plus-sized running back who caught a ton of passes. That led to, I believe it was almost 70 receptions, 69, 68 receptions. And then it led to the helium in his redraft and best ball ADPs. Last year was a disappointment, got hurt. We saw Zeke Elliott thrive when Stevenson went out. Then it's sort of Antonio Gibson signs. There's a little bit of mixed feelings on Rhamondre. He goes from like a third round pick last year to a very much in the dead zone this year, 7th rounder in redraft, 6th rounder in redraft. But then the Patriots talk him up. Jared Mayo talks about how enthusiastic they are about him. And then they give him this huge contract where he's a top 7 paid running back in the NFL. I'm sort of back with Rhamondre. I think Rhamondre is really interesting right now. Curious where you are at with Rhamondre Stevenson as a dynasty asset, because this contract certainly insulates him.
I think, and I don't know if you noticed this, but this is one of my favorite things to have happen in dynasty or redraft is when there's one year I'm down on a guy because of where the consensus is, and the next year I'm high on a guy because of where the consensus is, and I'm just kind of pretty much in the same place that I was the year before. Like I had him as a bust last year, but also as a low end RB2, and that's kind of what I think that he is this year. I would not be surprised with the new offensive system in New England if he has his best year as a rusher I think he's going to get good volume. I think he probably sees an increase in efficiency, maybe even an increase in rushing touchdowns. I think we're probably going to see another little pullback in terms of the passing game usage. But for a guy that's become now as cheap as he is relative to what his cost has been in the past, I'm still fine acquiring him as an RB2 on a contending roster. I don't think if you're not a contender at a 26-year-old running back, even with the contract, I don't care. You should not be acquiring him. But for a contender, I think he's a really good trade target as someone who will fill that RB2 spot and still has the low-end RB1 upside.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. And I think adding team context to this sort of answer is the correct one. If we're going to take on a running back of his age that isn't like it has some question marks, then I think it's got to be roster specific. But yeah, I mean, you could end up with a 2-year window of a player this year where the bet would be they're leaning on the running back position a lot to kind of protect the quarterbacks and the indecision wide receiver. But I think what's interesting is with this contract, New England's offense next year, if Drake May improves over the second half of the year and we feel enthusiastic about it, then you could be looking at like a top 15 offense next year where he's going to be locked in. So I'm into Rhamondre for sure. Let's talk about a player that the market is sort of beating up and nobody really wants to talk about him, and that's T. Higgins. You have obviously Jamar Chase to the moon, a lot of people's wide receiver 1 overall pick this year. Then you have Jermaine Burton, who's sort of become a helium player in multiple formats, the 3rd round pick out of Alabama, sort of looked at as the T. Higgins replacement. T. Higgins is franchise tagged, going to be there for 1 more year, it looks like. Is this a exploitable buying opportunity? With Higgins as a guy where it's easy to kind of poke holes in him and say that the production sort of never meets the profile, but it is a guy that I think we believe in athletically and we believe in his talent. But now we have no idea who he's going to be playing for in 2025. Is this I want to dive into that and buy him as a high-end wide receiver 3, or are you just had enough with T. Higgins?
No, and side note, I actually drafted T. Higgins at the end of round 8 in my Scott Fishbowl draft. I have no idea why he was there at pick 96, but I was thrilled to draft him there. I think really the answer to this question, I mean, first off, you need to put the numbers the last couple of years in context. He had 3 games a year ago where he played 26% of the snaps or fewer. So you look at that 22 season, you think, man, he played 16 games and that was all he produced. He really played 13. And then the same thing happened last year. And so I think you have to kind of look at T. Higgins and first make a decision. Do I think this guy is becoming Will Fuller and just can't stay healthy and always going to be leaving games hurt and playing partial games? And if that case, then this wide receiver 3 valuation makes sense. I don't believe that at all. I think it's mostly fluky happenstance over the last couple of years. And when you look at the full games that T. Higgins has played, even when Jamar Chase has been healthy, as long as Joe Burrow's been there and been right, he's been 15 points per game. He's been a wide receiver 2. I expect him to be a wide receiver 2 and a high-end wide receiver 2 at that this season. And he is a strong buy both in redraft and dynasty for me.
Yeah, and this is one where I was able to get him for like 2 second rounders in a single QB league around rookie draft time, and I felt really good about that one.
Yeah.
And it's
you should feel really bad about that because of what you did to that person. That was me.
Nah, come on, you got to teach teaching life lessons. Heath is part of the job. But when you simply just take a step back and you say, what is T. Higgins? What is his profile, and how will it appeal to other NFL teams when he goes on the open market? All you've got to do is look and see what Calvin Ridley got. Calvin Ridley at 28 years old gets this insane contract from Tennessee. It happens every single year where there's a wide receiver that gets paid an exorbitant amount of money. Now, NFL teams, I think, are going to be going out of their way to line up for T. Higgins because the relative youth and the fact that he's been productive on an NFL field. You look at him, and it's a guy where you say, well, maybe we could make him a 145 target guy immediately, as opposed to Cincinnati, where he's battling out with Chase. So definitely a very interesting one. One more player to talk about, just because the market is sort of beating him up, TJ Hawkinson, where you've got the combination of the injury and the combination of the quarterback question marks in Minnesota with how long is it going to take J.J. McCarthy to grab the job, and how long is it going to take J.J. McCarthy to put up fantasy points? So it's sort of like TJ Hawkinson last year was giving you a wide receiver 1 overall type points per game. Now you're getting him like tight end 8, tight end 9 in some of these startups. Is this a time to start kicking the tires on Hawkinson?
100% think that he is a buy in a dynasty format. I still think, and like, I don't think that he's going to be a lot better in terms of valuation until he gets back on the field, but then he's probably going to be a top 5 dynasty tight end once again. An easy buy, even at 27 years old, if you're not necessarily thinking about contending this year, because I would expect we've got 3 to 4 years of good tight end 1 production. The thing that I think is interesting with Hawkinson is how you view him in redraft, and it probably just depends on what you're. And this is true in dynasty as well, because I just kind of always assume that all dynasty leagues have IR spots in these deep rosters, and that's not true. His value is a little bit harder to stomach if you've got a shorter bench and you don't have a whole lot of IR spots, because it might get kind of hard that first half of the season keeping him on your bench. But as long as you've got the deeper bench, as long as you've got the IR spots, I think it's another strong buy.
Yeah, and it's also I love how you added context there, because if you're a productive struggle team and you're one of these dynasty startup managers who's like punting your year 1, drafting Hawkinson, you're going to have Hawkinson, like we talked about a little bit with New England. Let's say Hawkinson misses the entire season. He would step back into a offense with a year 2 quarterback in JJ McCarthy, surrounded by 2 great wide receivers, where Hawkinson is just sort of in a locked in position to give you top 10 tight end seasons for years and years to come, with the ceiling to give you a lot more. So I'm absolutely on Hawkinson. And I think it's interesting as a strategy right now, because there's not a whole lot of clarity on the injury, whether we should be taking some shots on him at this depressed ADP. If we somehow hear Hawkinson's going to miss 6 games, the ADP is going to move up based on where it is. I think he's being priced in to miss like more than half the season. So a lot of like lack of clarity with some of these injuries. We'll find out a lot with guys like Nick Chubb and TJ Hawkinson over the next few weeks. But we're reaching that point in the show. We're going to talk about some sell highs. And, you know, I think a great strategy is just looking at the ADP in best ball. Like, underdog is affecting everything in fantasy. And when you see some of these players shooting up, your league mates are as well. A player where maybe you didn't necessarily value them as a fringe first rounder, fringe second rounder, your league mates are going to say, this is the guy I need this year. So it's a opportunity for you to sell for a little bit more than you would have, say, when we were doing our rookie drafts and there was a lack of redraft or best ball ADP. So let's kick it to you, Heath. You have a player to start out our dynasty sells that is pretty much loved by the market right now, especially in startups, and that's Jordan Love.
I was looking at, for the purpose of this, I was like, let me see what Dynasty League football is recent, like June ADP, like just recent ADP. And I see Jordan Love at QB 11, which I think it's really hard to argue a lot between that 11 through 16 range, except for the fact that he's 1 spot ahead of Jaden Daniels, which to me is just completely insane. Part of this is the fact that, no, I don't really believe entirely that Jordan Love's 32 passing touchdowns, and I think it was 4 rushing touchdowns on 50 attempts, are completely repeatable. But also, it's just a philosophical thing. He's not going to be a quarterback who runs for 400 or 500 yards. And I don't think in this system he's going to be a quarterback who throws the ball 650 times, 579 pass attempts last year on a 9-8 season. I wouldn't expect a huge increase in the pass volume. And those guys are simply borderline QB1s. And there's generally a lot of them. And so usually the guy that's at the top of the list and I like, when I look at my rankings, Love is in that group with Purdy, with Tua, with Trevor Lawrence. I don't think there's actually much of a distinction between those guys. And the market has all of a sudden, because of a really strong finish to the year and some good touchdown production, gained a lot of certainty on Love over all 3 of those guys. And I disagree with the certainty almost as much as I disagree with Love over Jaden Daniels.
And it's very interesting because you're able to tier down from Jordan Love down to like Trevor Lawrence, which would have been unheard of a year ago. Love certainly earned that respect, played great in the NFL playoffs for, 7 out of the 8 quarters. But for me, it's like a Trevor Lawrence and a pick.
Yes.
You're able to get that for Jordan Love. You can get Brock Purdy and like 2 picks because there's still the Brock Purdy isn't really good. Well, his situation is incredible. So that's an interesting one. It's really difficult to kind of stomach trading a Jordan Love right now, but a lot of times those trades where it feels a bit uncomfortable to make are the ones who reap you the biggest benefits as a dynasty manager. And that's sort of how I will start out with my candidates. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Jonathan Taylor. And Jonathan Taylor is a guy where we're going to rank him pretty highly at Player Profiler in terms of the running back rankings. And he's a guy that I have a good deal of exposure to. But I am seeing him starting to go occasionally ahead of Jahmyr Gibbs. And he's neck and neck with Jahmyr Gibbs in these redraft formats like FFPC and NFFC. In FFPC, you're routinely seeing Jonathan Taylor at the 1-2 turn. So for me, it's Taylor had the incredible contract given to him last year, which he obviously earned. He was a great player for Indianapolis, but we still don't know how he's going to be in a full season next to Anthony Richardson. And in that offense, you could see Anthony Richardson being a little bit more of a touchdown vulture than Jonathan Taylor fantasy managers would like to see. If he's going to return value at the 1-2 turn, then he's going to have to finish towards the top of the NFL in rushing yardage and towards the top of the NFL in rushing touchdowns, because we are not going to see Jonathan Taylor be a heavily targeted player out of the backfield. He's only had one season where he had like 40 receptions. So for me, I see some running backs behind Taylor that I would be happy to tier down to. If you tell me I could get Travis Etienne and something on top, that's a deal I'm going to consider in Dynasty. And I think this might be the last year we see Taylor being a top like 15 running back. I think next year he could be a guy that's maybe going down 10, 12 spots in redraft ADP, despite the fact that I think Indianapolis is going to score a lot of points. Your thoughts on Taylor?
I think from the perspective of, is this guy going to gain or lose value? Lose is easily the strong bet. I have a hard time with Taylor trades in either direction, because like you mentioned the Gibbs thing, I'd be happy to deal him straight up for Gibbs. I've got a pretty significant difference in my like overall trade value between those two players. It's almost exactly the same, though, for me as the difference between him and the guy who's directly below him in my rankings, who is Travis Etienne. He just kind of, and that's the way that it seems like the running back rankings have set up right now. Like Bijan and Breece Hall are the clear 1-2 for me. Gibbs, and then however you want to rank Christian McCaffrey, like it shouldn't really even exist on a linear rankings list, because half the league, I don't know what they would do with him. But then there's this gap to Taylor, and then another big gap to everyone else. I think you make a really good point on the catches. And for that purpose, I think you should probably view Taylor differently in a half PPR league than you do in a full PPR league. It's going to be hard for him to keep up with the real true pass catchers at the position if catches are worth a full point.
Let's take it back to redraft just for a second. Where are you at on Gibbs versus Taylor this year redraft?
I am still kind of, I guess maybe semi-reluctantly, but I still have Taylor over Gibbs this year. They're pretty much, they're back-to-back in my rankings. It's RB4 and RB5, and they're back-to-back in my overall rankings, like right there at the 1-2 turn. So I just, the age difference is enough in Dynasty to make Gibbs the clear value, but I could still see David Montgomery scoring double-digit touchdowns for the Lions this year.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting one. And you also listed a very highly drafted running back in Saquon Barkley, first year in Philly. And now you're seeing him routinely selected, like let's call him a mid-second round pick in some of these high stakes. Occasionally gets drafted a little bit closer to the 1-2 turn. Your thoughts on cashing out right now?
Somebody I was really shocked to see it, like in their heading into their age 27 season, still listed as RB8 in the running back dynasty ADP, ahead of some guys that are 2, 3, 4, 5 years younger than him. I don't think that I see the same boost in going to Philadelphia that everyone else seems to. Barkley is my RB9 in the projections for this season, but a considerable difference behind like the Gibbs type range. And I think they're just as much risk, probably more risk than there is upside. I don't expect the tush push to go away. I don't think Barkley's all of a sudden going to start getting goal line carries. I don't think there's going to be a big increase in running back targets in Philadelphia just because Barkley's there, because we've not seen really Kellen Moore or Jalen Hurts ever do that. And I'm not sure that the efficiency boost is quite as big as everyone is projecting it to be. I think that loss in efficiency over the last couple of years is just the fact that Saquon Barkley is not the guy he was the first 2 years that he was in the NFL.
I think that's a really interesting one. And, bringing up the targets once again, we saw DeAndre Swift at a career low in targets last year, despite being very efficient as a runner. Like DeAndre Swift gave us 1,000 rushing yards. If we would have seen him get 20 more targets, he could have been a guy who had a much more effective fantasy season. It's a Taylor type argument. You're relying on a lot of rushing yards. You're relying on a lot of rushing touchdowns, because he's going to have a cap ceiling as a receiver out of this backfield. I think anytime you have a player that you don't think can give you a 70 catch season, and you're able to cash out a lot in Dynasty at the running back spot, you have to consider it. He's definitely a guy, Heath, also where the market is so enthusiastic about him that you could use him as a tier up player, where you could add to Saquon Barkley and maybe move to a running back that you think could have a better season or more longevity in Dynasty. So I think you could kind of play that one both ways. Very interesting name. For me, I'm going to throw out DK Metcalf. I talked a little bit about JSN, how I think he's going to take a step forward. DK is sort of like the 26-year-old season heading into 27, but it's sort of the idea of DK Metcalf and the production with DK Metcalf doesn't really line up, where the last 3 years we've seen him finish anywhere from wide receiver 20 to wide receiver 24. He's had one season in his career where he finished as a wide receiver 1, and that was his second year in the league. A lot of times he's been like a low-end wide receiver 2 in points per game. Now you sort of have the life preserver of a new system in place where DK is going to reach his potential, because now we have a coaching staff who gets it and understands what they're doing. On the flip side, though, I think JSN projects as a target earner, and I think he's going to limit DK's ceiling as being like some vacuum. And you still have the annoying presence of Tyler Lockett, and you have 2 running backs who I think they're going to get touches for in Ken Walker and Zach Charbonnet. So for me, it's a DK, the perception of DK, and the renewed enthusiasm about the system he's in creates an opportunity for me to cash out on him. I'll take a couple of these rookie wide receivers for DK Metcalf and re-roll it. I could get a Brian Thomas and a DK Metcalf. The difference for me is age, and we've already seen it with DK. They profile similarly, and I think a year from now, Brian Thomas is going to be, it's like, how did you pull that trade-off kind of deal? This is Trevor Lawrence's wide receiver 1, and DK is the, a 1B in Seattle, and he had 125 targets last year.
I think that the thing that I like the most about your argument, and I get into this discussion a lot when people are talking about JSN. I think if you're going to be pro JSN, it has to be more than he's just going to take over for Tyler Lockett. Like I think if you're going to be pro JSN, you probably should be anti DK Metcalf, because the blip we saw from Geno Smith of really good production for a couple of fantasy wide receivers, I don't actually believe that's going to happen again this year. And so I like that. DK is a guy that, just kind of listening to you talk, I was looking at my Dynasty rankings, and I'm like, no, I don't. I've got him too high. And it is exactly what you said. He came into the NFL as this guy that possessed an immense amount of upside. Look at him with his shirt off. Look at that upside. And we saw basically one flash of it. And at this point in his career, what we've seen the last 3 seasons, and with an ascendant JSN, I'll disregard the annoying Tyler Lockett comment. I'm a big Tyler Lockett backer.
Well, annoying in the royal sense. Tyler, I'm sure Tyler Lockett's a great guy, Heath, but annoying to my fantasy teams.
He is annoying if you don't have him on your team, and some weeks he's annoying when you're playing against him. Some weeks he's annoying when you play him. No, I think that what you said makes a lot of sense. He's probably better viewed as just, that's what he is, a low-end number 2 wide receiver.
Yeah, definitely an interesting one. Uh, and DK Metcalf, another weird thing about him is the diet. The guy is like proudly eating like more candy a day. I don't know if anybody
I
hasn't
don't
read this
understand it.
one. Yeah, it's like the guy eats like one meal and then the all day long eats just candy, like bags and bags of it. I mean, the guy's an absolute specimen.
So
It's working for him
MarShawn
now.
had the Skittles thing too. What is it with this Seattle and candy? Is it just because it rains all the time and they need the candy to bring them joy?
Get
They
some
don't ever see the
sunshine.
sun.
Get some sunshine, guys. Get some sunshine. Leave
The sun doesn't
gummy
exist
bears.
up there.
That's right. That's right. Depressing times in Seattle. And speaking of depressing, this is one name on your list of players you want to trade away. This one made me a little sad because I'm bullish on this guy. Talk about David Njoku, Heath, and why we should consider trading him.
I am considering trading him because I think Deshaun Watson's going to stay healthy this year. And if you look at Kevin Stefanski's offense in Cleveland, and we saw it last year with Trey McBride in Arizona, I think it's reason to be optimistic about Hunter Henry in New England. Like that Stefanski system is a tight end centric one. It's often a 2 tight end one too, so it kind of dilutes it a little bit. But it really came to fruition last year when Deshaun Watson got hurt. And you look at Stefanski's history, it's a 24 to 28% target share for tight ends in his system, unless Deshaun Watson is playing quarterback. And when Deshaun Watson's playing quarterback, those targets are YOLO shots down the field to Amari Cooper. He was throwing the ball probably to Elijah Moore more than he should have last season. And now they went out and got Jerry Jeudy. I just don't think that it will be as the volume will be there for Njoku. And he's still being valued as a low-end tight end one. But if he comes out at the start of the season and doesn't look anything like what we saw at the end of the last year, his value is going to just completely disappear. You won't be able to get anything for him.
Yeah, and I think you sort of nailed it with the way to exploit the market. Like FFPC, if you're in a redraft for FFPC, you're having to use a 6th round pick on David Njoku. A year ago, you were getting him in like the 9th, 10th round. So he's definitely a guy who's risen, and he earned it because he was so effective down the stretch and was a fantasy playoffs winner. I'll take a more optimistic approach here that it's really hard to put it back away. After Njoku made that huge step forward in the second half of last year, it's Deshaun Watson. They're going to have some manufactured plays for Njoku, and it's like the tight end screens that they were doing with like Alex Van Pelt. Are they going to keep that as part of the game plan? I realize it's Ken Dorsey. He's going to be this more aggressive guy. You talked about Amari Cooper. I think that's a great trade candidate with all these RPOs and all the stuff they're going to do, but maybe they're going to stick with sort of the Njoku game plan just to kind of play devil's advocate. But you're absolutely right on a guy that's gained ADP value, selling potentially at the peak of his dynasty valuation in Njoku. And for me, we talked about him a little bit earlier, but even though the market is a little bit more beat up on this player than like the day he signed with Green Bay, Josh Jacobs, I'm looking to kind of kick the tires on because I think this is going to be more of a split backfield than some people think. It's sort of an inverse effect where I want all of the MarShawn Lloyd and I want to trade away some Josh Jacobs shares, even if it means I'm getting like 85, 90 cents on the dollar, because I still think that you're going to find people in your dynasty league that are going to be super bullish about RB12 in ADP right now in redraft but I think there's just a lot of red flags. You also have the fact that Josh Jacobs is 26 years old and he's got a lot of tread on the tires, where last year we saw him break down towards the end of last season, miss a little bit of time. But when you switch teams, you're in a new scheme, you're 26, but these guys had multiple high volume years. You always worry about when that's going to catch up to guys as well. So it's age, tread on the tires, and also the threat of a really good running back who's more of a 50-50, 60-40 type with MarShawn Lloyd.
So just working back to a guy that we talked about earlier, because I was looking at my rankings, looking at ADP. I've got Josh Jacobs ranked at RB15. He is currently RB15 by Dynasty ADP, so fine. But I have Rhamondre Stevenson right behind him. And that he's not anywhere close to right behind him in ADP. This is another guy where you could trade down from Jacobs to Stevenson and absolutely pick up a pretty good asset. And I think they're probably similar to the same guy, with Gibson taking a little bit more passing down work in New England than we would like, and Lloyd maybe doing a little bit more in that regard in Green Bay than we would like.
In a super flex format, if you offer Josh Jacobs for Rhamondre Stevenson and a second rounder, and I would even ask for Rhamondre a second and a third,
Yep.
and I think that you're going to get a counter maybe for Rhamondre in a second. That's a trade where I think you have multiple outs. And when it comes down to it, I think Rhamondre, if we look at who scores more fantasy points over the next 2 years, it might be Rhamondre,
Right.
where there's this massive threat. Gibson is not quite the threat that I think Gibson will be a guy who maybe caps the receiving upside, but is not a guy that's going to be a huge threat to him in terms of his carries attempts
Right.
and the bell cow usage. So I'm with you. I think that's a very, very good pivot consideration. Let's go back to you. You have another Indianapolis Colt. We already talked about Jonathan Taylor as a guy that I would consider trading. You have Michael Pittman Jr.
Yeah, and I saw a discussion yesterday about Michael Pittman Jr. and just how he just feels a little bit boring. And I hate to say it that way, but he had basically one long play last year, and that was the only one he's had in the last 2 seasons. He is a guy who's very volume dependent. And I think it's fair to wonder, as good and pleasantly surprised as I was with Anthony Richardson's pocket presence early last year in the small sample size that we saw, I still don't think we know exactly what the pass volume is going to be for this offense. Kind of the questions you had about Taylor, a full season with Richardson, I have about Pittman, a full season with Richardson. And I don't know that he really, we have at least a little bit of reason to see that upside with DK Metcalf. Look at him with his shirt off. Look what he did. He did that one season. I don't have any of that hope for Michael Pittman. I'm just hoping he's going to string together 4 more wide receiver 2 seasons for me.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. And I think you nailed it with he's a player that needs a lot of targets.
Yeah.
And anytime you have a guy like that, there are some of these players where you can paint a picture where 120 targets, you're still cooking. A guy like Brandon Ayuk had less than 110 last year, but a guy like Michael Pittman Jr., for him to go, we saw what he could do with 150 last year. What happens if that goes down 15%? Mm-hmm. And also, I believe he is the alpha in the offense, but I do think Adonai Mitchell is a ridiculous athlete and a guy who they're going to make part of the weekly game plan. Then you add Josh Downs, Josh Downs was very good last year, and Josh Downs set the record for Indianapolis catches by an Indianapolis rookie receiver. So he's a guy where I think internally as an organization, they're more enthusiastic about Downs than maybe we are as fantasy managers. So there's target competition a little bit more so than Michael Pittman Jr. is used to. If you simply look back at 2 years ago, it was him and Alec Pierce. Now he's got these 2 better players, and also Alec Pierce out there for some deep shots from Richardson. So I think that's an interesting one, and definitely would be a sell high type guy with Michael Pittman Jr., especially after his big season last year. For me, I'm going to stay at the running back position. I have a couple of running backs, but it's James Cook, and I really like James Cook, and I've made bull arguments for him. But at the end of the day, it's a player that sometimes leaves a little bit more, like you're expecting a little bit more. The dropped touchdown catches, the fumbles. And now you have the perception that this guy, along with Dalton Kincaid, is going to be the skill position leaders for the Buffalo Bills. James Cook is going to cost you about running back 14 in redraft, and he's about there in the Dynasty rankings too. He's a high-end RB2 in Dynasty rankings on a lot of sites. And for me, it's sort of there's a little bit of pressure with Ray Davis behind him if the fumbles happen. And also, does he take a step forward? Like last year was such a win for James Cook Dynasty managers, whether it was redraft, whether it was best ball, whether it was even Dynasty, you got a huge win. And now the market is really overcorrected it. Is James Cook a borderline Dynasty RB1? I don't think so. And I think the market's treating him like that, where I think I would look to maybe cash out. He's a guy where I could pivot and I could still get a lot for him. And I also could use James Cook as a 2-for-1 guy to pivot up. I could take a wide receiver that's maybe a wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3, and combine him with James Cook and get myself into a higher end running back or a higher end wide receiver. Perfect 2-for-1 type candidate with James Cook. I hate doing it. I have a lot of him in Dynasty, and I still think he's going to be pretty effective this year, but it's really this might be peak market time.
I could understand that argument. And if you just took the name off of it and showed me the chart of the value, then I think I'd probably buy in a little bit easier. As much as David Njoku might have hurt your feelings when you saw him on my list, this was the one that really got me because I'm pretty heavily invested in James Cook this season in all formats. I think that the 2 rushing touchdowns last year was a little bit of bad luck. I look at the usage once they changed offensive coordinators, and he was on pace for something like 289 carries and 66 targets over his 10 games with the new offensive coordinator. And I just see a guy, and then they get rid of Stephon Diggs and Gabe Davis, and I don't think they did a very good job of replacing them. So I do really buy into Cook more than I'm buying into Kincaid this year on the Bills offense. I think he's a high volume workhorse running back that I don't think could just be a number 1 running back. I think he could be a top 5 running back this season.
Well, I hope he's a top 5. I hope I'm wrong on this one because I'm holding a ton of them in Dynasty right now. And I actually have a good amount in best ball because, like you said, it's sort of a Josh Allen has moved down in now. This is turning into like a redraft show, but the quarterback market has moved so hard from last year, where like Josh Allen has moved down in ADP in 2024 versus 2023 that he's sort of become a little bit more of an option for me. And when I'm looking to correlate him or stack him, I can go with James Cook or Dalton Kincaid and not really worry about trying to figure out which wide receiver to bet on. So I'm with you. I think there is some correlation there. It's just for me, it's a matter of, is this the peak? But hey, if James Cook gives us a top 5 redraft season, that he's absolutely a steal at his current dynasty valuation. So butting heads a little bit, but I hope I'm wrong on this one, Heath, because I got plenty. And we're going to kick it back to you. This is your last one, and this is a wide receiver that was tremendous last year in DJ Moore.
I mean, certainly a buy, kind of like the same thing as I hope I'm wrong about this one, but like James Cook, just really increased his value. And then he gets Caleb Williams, the number 1 quarterback in the draft. I am just a little bit concerned about everything else that he got, though, with the addition of Keenan Allen, who Adam Azer made the point on our podcast today. Do you realize that Keenan Allen has been better than DJ Moore every single season of DJ Moore's career on a per game basis? And that's true, but Keenan Allen's had a little bit better quarterback. And then the addition of Rome Odunze also, like I see Allen being viewed as this top 20 wide receiver as a 27-year-old. And I don't really think there's a whole lot of hope that he's got a top 12 season in him this year. I think there's almost certainly going to be some regression from the numbers that we saw last year. And there's at least a little bit of risk that either Keenan Allen is the number 1 target earner or Rome Odunze is this world changer as a wide receiver. I know a lot of people before the draft said that the 3 wide receivers in this class would have been the best 3 wide receivers in each of the last 2 classes. And if Odunze is that type of guy, well, he might really harm things for both Moore or Allen. And then there's some concern about just like the guy who was throwing him the ball and the guy who was designing those plays last season are both gone.
I love how you phrase that. And we talked about this on your podcast when it was NFL draft time about just how good this trio of wide receivers is and how Rome Odunze is a guy that we should already have as a dynasty wide receiver 1. Now Rome Odunze lands in the target competition place. But I think for me, it's Keenan Allen, I think should be effective, but just how effective on a new team remains to be seen. But to me, Rome Odunze is the massive threat because at the end of the day, it's very difficult to have 2 wide receivers that are valued as like wide receiver 1s in Dynasty. And DJ Moore, there's still people that are going to consider him that after last season. Rome Odunze, it's sort of a parallel to me like a CeeDee Lamb rookie year where DJ Moore is the Amari Cooper. Yeah. And this could be a situation where the values flip very, very quickly in all formats. I think Odunze is the real deal, and I think that's the real threat. If you hold on to DJ Moore, it's not going to be something that's going to like hurt your roster. But it's if you're counting on him to be one of your anchor wide receiver, maybe the wide receiver 1 on your dynasty team, that's something where I would worry about a little bit. I think you want to really treat him more like a wide receiver 2, which is what he was for most seasons until last year. So that's definitely one that's going to get some people a little bit upset. And I'm going to close the show out. This is a kind of a low-hanging fruit one, but Zamir White. Zamir White is 24 years old. We've seen him play well in 4 games. Even if you like him as a short-term play in redraft or best ball, he's still a sell in Dynasty. This is a guy where the sample size is too small. We don't have a whole lot of examples of players who did nothing, Heath, and then sort of came on and played 4 games and then all of a sudden became, a locked-in Dynasty long-term asset. He's very much benefits from who else is going to carry the ball. And anytime you have a player who the argument is who else is going to get the touches, it's usually a guy I want to move on from. Alexander Mattison last year, we had a Justin Forsett season like this where these guys steam up in redraft and we have an opportunity to sell them in Dynasty. Even if you like Zamir White this year in best ball and redraft, he's still a guy you want to kick the tires on in Dynasty because this is a guy where he's going to turn 25 and we have 4 games where he did anything in his NFL career.
I think this is absolutely one of those guys where it's just really going to depend on how sharp your league is. Because I hear a lot more Zamir White slander on Twitter and within our bubble that you and I exist in than I hear anybody hyping him up or excited to get him. But I do think that there's a lot of leagues that a lot of people play in where there's some people who are just looking for how can I get myself that RB2 that's going to get a lot of work? And Zamir White has that perfect profile. So if you can move him and get starting running back value, I'm all for that. If you're having to settle for flex value, for RB3 value, and I'm a contender, I'm probably just holding I get the points.
It's an interesting player because of his relative youth and now his opportunity, but there's profiles in this draft class like a MarShawn Lloyd, like a Blake Corum, where you could pivot off and make that sort of trade, and you get a player where prospect-wise you were much higher on, it's sort of a philosophical thing. And I'm glad you brought up hey, I'm just going to kind of suck it up. He's already on my roster. It could kind of be a sunk cost if you're in a high-level Dynasty league, you're not going to get value for Zamir White. But if you're in a league where guys sort of have short-term thinking, yeah, maybe there's a guy out there, Heath, that really wants to overpay you for Zamir White. This was awesome. We gave you 10 players. This was really, really fun to go through this process. A little depressing to hear some of these names, but always a blast to podcast with you, Heath. Let everybody know once again where they can find your work.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Heath Cummings SR. You can find Fantasy Football Today Dynasty on YouTube or anywhere that you find podcasts, and you can find my written content over at CBS Fantasy. I always enjoy talking to you, Theo. I sit here and I update my Dynasty rankings as I'm listening to you talk because I always learn something. Thanks for having me on.
Anytime. I'm sure we'll do it again. And stick with us here at Dynasty Life. We're going to be dropping episodes like this every week up into the season. We'll see you soon.